Hello, and I hope you all are having a wonderful day. Today, Griffin and I will be discussing the Lowell Mill Girls and how they were able to create the first union consisting of only women. First, we will be starting with a timeline that starts in 1820, which is considered to be the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in America. And by the mid-1800s, textile mills grew in popularity, but specifically in Lowell, Massachusetts. Here they would employ many women to work in these textile mills so that they could have some economic freedom and be able to provide for their families. However, in 1834, mill owners of Lowell announced that they would be cutting the wages of the mill girls, and this enraged those mill girls because they were not being treated fairly in the first place by their bosses in comparison to their male counterparts. They were not being treated fairly economically because they were not being paid the same, as well as not being treated fairly socially. And thus the first strike had been made. In 1834, the mill girls had gone to other mills and gathered up all their women to have a walkout in form of a protest. However, this walkout did not last long. And by 1836, another pay cut for the mill girls had begun. The girls tried to have another walkout in form of protest, and their male bosses were shocked by this because they did not think that the women would have the courage to go out and protest against them. However, this was also cut short because they had all of the power and resources that these women needed in order to make money. So the girls tried to find another way to protest against them and these unfair labor practices. And thus, the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association was made in the early 1840s. Once the women realized that their walkouts and strikes were not working, they decided to create the first female labor union in the country. And while women did not have the right to vote at this point in time in the United States, they pressed lawmakers to pass laws capping the workday at textile mills to only 10 hours a day. This would help solve the unfair labor practice of too many long hours, but they still had other things that they needed to work on as well. And additionally, they published a newsletter that exposed the horrible working conditions in the mills and worked to organize chapters in mill towns across New England. This was a big step in the right direction, and by 1847, New Hampshire passed a state law imposing a 10-hour workday at textile mills. This would become to be seen as the first one for female union workers in the United States. Now, who all was involved in the making of the first women's union? Obviously, the Lowell Mill Girls. These girls were only 15 to 35 years old at the time, and it took a lot of courage and a lot of willpower to be able to speak up against the male bosses at the time, especially considering all of the sexist practices that were in place. Another big part in the making of the first women's union were the mill owners of New England. These male bosses had a big part in making these women fight up against the unfair labor practices that they were dealing with. From the long hours that they were working to the unfair pay that they were receiving, the women realized that they could stand up and fight for what they believed to be right. And thus, the first union consisting of only women was born. And lastly, the last contributor into making the first women's union would be the lawmakers that these women had gone to. These lawmakers would have to work with these women and to fight for what they would believe is right and to go against their unfair labor practices. Without these lawmakers, the New Hampshire state law of a 10-hour workday would have never been passed, and we never would have seen the growth in female labor unions as we do today. And while the women in the union realized that they would not really be able to see the benefits from the labor organization, their daughters and their granddaughters would see the benefits. They demonstrated that women can stand up against unfair labor practices and that they could have a voice and push for change, and the lawmakers were able to help them reach this goal.
One textile factory opened by a young Boston man named Francis Cabot Lowell consolidated the process of turning cloth into cotton in a single building. After Lowell died, his partners built a town around his textile factories and named it after him. The factories of Lowell, Massachusetts drew young women from all over New England, some as young as 16. They came to supplement their family's income, but more importantly, they came to discover a new life, one of opportunity and independence.
Lowell is one of the most important cities in the American Industrial Revolution. It's really the first large-scale industrial city built solely for the purpose of producing cloth and producing profit for the mill owners. Here they were able to bring together capital, nature in the form of the river to create a power system, and also bring in a new kind of labor system to create this first large-scale city. Lowell became a model for other industrial cities, and throughout the 19th century, places like Lawrence and Manchester up and down the Merrimack River Valley, and then ultimately all across New England and up and down the eastern seaboard would model themselves after Lowell. So this is really where industrial America begins.
Population explodes from 200 in 1820 to nearly 20,000 in just 15 years. More than a third of the town works in the mills. 85% are single women between 15 and 25.
When women really joined the workforce in the cotton mills and the thread factories, I think it gave women an opportunity to get out, be serious about being breadwinners, and it changed the whole fabric of America.
But the life of a mill girl was not easy. Harriet Hansen, like most, worked 6 days a week. The working hours of all the girls extended from 5 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock in the evening, she recalled. The factories were noisy and unhealthy. The air swarmed with lint, leaving the workers susceptible to lung disease. The textile companies formed a solid employers' bloc. All agreed to pay their workers the same amount, so there could be no wage wars. The mill companies cut wages and then hiked boarding house rents.
The market is glutted and prices continue to fall. We are being forced to sell our cloth for less. Therefore, we must find ways to be more productive and lower costs.
Well, everyone is working diligently.
Perhaps costs could be cut by having each girl tend 3 machines instead of 2.
That may be hard on some of the girls. Well, since each weaver will be producing more cloth, at least they can make more money on their piece rate.
I've already considered that point. Since each weaver will be producing more cloth, we can lower the piece rate, and they can still earn the same as before, if they can keep up.
What is it going to take for us to make a stand? Stand up for us.
We, the undersigned, considering ourselves wronged and our privileges invaded by our unjust and unreasonable lowering of our wages, do hereby mutually and cheerfully...
I marched out and was followed by the others. As I looked back at the long line that followed me, I was more proud than I shall ever be again.
Years before there was a women's movement, when a woman speaking in public was a rarity. Some of the first strikes in Lowell were organized and led by women.
So to break down the Lowell Mills girls' strikes, we have to break it down into the 2 different years that they occurred in, 1834 and 1836. So in 1834, you had, due to the reduction in wages at the Lowell's textile mills that the board of directors had voted on, the women involved, the Lowell Mills girls in this instance, decided that they would do a turnout, which is basically where they would withdraw their savings. This caused a run on 2 local banks in the town. And this initial strike failed because, like most strikes that failed, they did not get the public support on their side of the surrounding town. So within a few days, with no support from the town, the strikers ended up going back to work without having their demands met. And this is a blow initially to the labor movement as a whole, but it set the foundation to where companies would have to deal with the very likely possibility that their employees one day might have had enough and they could do a strike or some other kind of work stoppage that eventually would lead to a lot of profit losses for that. So in 1836 we had the second strike, and for that one it was a lot more successful. and a huge part of that was due to the public support that they garnered this time. The turnout for this, as far as the number of people striking, was actually twice as big as earlier in 1834. So they had approximately 1,500 workers that were striking. And that, of course, led to the textile mills operating far below capacity, which in turn hindered their profit-gaining operations. The cause of the 1836 strike was different in that it involved a rent hike vice a wage reduction. So this rent hike was the company was trying to pass it on to the ladies that worked in the textile mills, and that was a violation of the written contract between the textile mill and their employees. So because of that, they garnered that larger public support. The board of directors actually rescinded the rent hike, and then the ladies went back to work, so the strike actually worked. As I was kind of researching this, I noticed in some articles they were saying how even though it was a successful strike and they got their demands were met, apparently conditions rapidly deteriorated, not only in the town of Lowell, but all over the country. There's actually a pretty large recession/depression the country went through around that time in 1837. It's called the Panic of 1837. So with that strike in 1836, while it was successful, it didn't lead to a lot of short-term gains for the labor movement, but I think kind of touching on what we're supposed to be taking away from this assignment in the grand schemes of the American labor movement, it set the foundation.
The Lowell Mill girls were a force to be reckoned with, and with the ways that they were being treated, it was only a matter of time before the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association came into fruition. The Lowell girls paved the way for the women in the workplace for years to come.